So welcome everyone. My name is Mark Winfield. I'm a professor of environmental and urban change at York University. And I'm also co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative at the university. And this webinar is one in a series that we've been doing on decarbonization and electricity with a focus in particular on Ontario. We will, as I mentioned, we are recording this and we'll make it available on the SEI website. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement, but of course, we are in remote territory or space. So I also invite people to reflect on where they are and the history behind those lands. York University, for its part, recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University's campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and also note that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So welcome to all. Thank you. Merci, Megwich. As I mentioned, this is the fourth in our series of webinars on future directions around decarbonization and electricity in Ontario. And one of the things that's come up repeatedly in many of the studies that we've talked about in this webinar series around pathways to decarbonization and net zero for Ontario and for Canada for that matter has been around the availability of hydroelectric and other renewable energy resources, in particular from Quebec, for grid balancing and storage purposes. And indeed, in a number of the previous sessions, these questions have arisen around the state of Quebec's electricity and energy systems and what the implications there are for the decarbonization of electricity systems in neighboring jurisdictions. I'm very fortunate that through various projects, we've made contact with a number of folks in Quebec, and indeed in these conversations, we've been told that all roads or most roads seem to lead to Pierre Olivier Pineau, who is with the HEC at the University of Montréal, and he is a professor there in the Department of Decision Sciences and also holds the chair in energy sector management at HEC. He is an energy policy and management specialist with a focus on electricity reform. He's published many papers on the energy sector, most of them exploring links between energy and some aspects of sustainable development. He's been appointed by the Gouvernement de Quebec to its climate change advisory panel. He's the author of the book, The Energy Balance, although that is en français sous le mot, and also co-author of The State of Energy in Quebec and also The State of Energy in Northeastern North America. So Pierre Olivier is exceptionally well positioned to speak about this subject of where things stand in Quebec and their implications around decarbonization within the region. We'll follow the same approach that we've taken in the past with these sessions. So I will invite Pierre Olivier to do a presentation initially, and he will do a screen share. I'd ask people to hold questions until the end of that. We are in a Zoom meeting mode as opposed to a webinar, so people can ask questions directly. I'd ask you to use the raise hand function in the reactions icon in Zoom, and Zoom then gives us an order in which people have put their hands up. I'd ask people to be as brief as possible and concise in their questions. I will also keep an eye on the chat because we've learned through these, sometimes people ask questions through the chat. I do my best to stay on top of that as well. We are scheduled to run potentially until 2, but we will see how things go in terms of questions and discussion. And as I mentioned, we're recording the session, and then we will make it available on the SEI website in the next couple of days, just in terms of the amount of time it takes to put it up on YouTube. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Pierre Olivier, and invite him to do his presentation. And then we will go back into this mode for the question and answer session. So Pierre Olivier, the floor is yours. Merci.
Good. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for the invitation. I'm always happy to talk about energy. It's my specialty, and energy policy is incredibly interesting these days. So of course, things don't move as quickly and as positively as many of us think, but it's important to understand the situation in different provinces in Canada, in the region. So I'll talk about the state of energy in Quebec and its implications for Canada. And actually, it's more maybe for the Northeast, as you can see on the map on the screen. So I only have 17 slides, but there's some content that is worth discussing on each of them. But I'll try to make a presentation of what I wanted to share with you, but I'll try, of course, to leave some room for questions. Well, these slides are, well, the deck of slides will be available if Mark wants to share it. And many slides are coming from the report we publish every year with Joanne Whitmore, the state of energy in Quebec. It's only in French, although in 2019 we did an English version of it. So if your French is not fluent, then maybe you want to check the 2019 version. And as many of the slides are actually coming from the 2023 State of Energy in Quebec, which is in French, it will be a French lesson or a French course for you, because you will see some French words here and there, but I'll make the presentation in English. Two things, of course, for the outline. I'll first talk about the current energy and electricity situation in Quebec, and then we'll go for the my regional analysis and implications, and then in the discussion we can go for more. So that is probably that's a Sankey diagram of the state of energy in Quebec. It's probably the most important slide if you want to fully understand the energy systems in Quebec. Quebec is extremely lucky because we have lots of local and renewable sources. So you see on the top left corner of the slide, the wind, hydro, biomass. It's mostly going into the electricity generation and then distribution. And as you can see, if you follow the spaghettis, as I call them, then it goes into buildings. And I didn't translate that, it's bâtiment in French, so building sector, and then industry. The industry sector is quite big in Quebec, and that's the only consumption sector that is actually bigger than the Ontario sector, because of course you are twice the population in Ontario compared to Quebec. So in buildings you use around, roughly twice the amount of energy. Same thing in transport. The third block of consumption in the consumption band. And although 2020 here was a year that you may recall where we spent many hours at home, so our energy consumption in transport is actually lower than usual. So normally it's bigger in transport, but that year it was that level. Ontario has roughly again twice the amount of energy consumption in transport. Same thing in buildings. Industry, we're leading, and the reason we're leading in energy consumption is because we have so much electricity coming in the industrial sector. And they came to Quebec because we still have plenty of cheap hydropower, so aluminum plants and pulp and paper and some other industries, but mostly aluminum. Build their plants in Quebec because it was interesting to come, and it was cheap, and it is still cheap for them because they are incumbents and they benefit from the cheap electricity. So you see lots of local renewable sources. Wind is growing and will grow in the next years. The amount of petajoule you see here, that's every time I get some questions on that, it's not the amount of electricity produced by wind, but it's the wind, the primary wind energy that is transformed in wind turbine in electricity. So roughly you need to divide that amount by 4 to get in petajoule the amount of electricity produced by wind. but that's the primary energy in wind that you get. And the same thing for all the numbers you see on the left. They are the primary energy amounts that are coming from the different sectors. As for all Canadian provinces, oil is our main energy source. Although in 2020 it was, you can see the number is slightly lower than hydro, because again, that's because in 2020 we used less gasoline and diesel. But crude oil is very important. Natural gas is very small. It's a third the amount, probably less than a third the amount that Ontario is using. And the key reason for natural gas to be that small compared to Ontario or Canada in general, it's because we have already electrified building heating to some extent, not totally, but to a larger extent. You see the amount of electricity going in buildings. It's about 2/3. So that's of course much more than in many provinces. In the residential sector in particular, 80% of buildings, residential buildings, are heated with electricity. Natural gas is still present. There are huge fights in Quebec or huge fights. Some groups call for a very quick phase out of natural gas in residential and all buildings. That would create some challenges in terms of peak electricity demand, and that's a constraining factor. So Hydro-Quebec is really reluctant to fully electrify all building currently heated with natural gas because of the peak consumption issues that would create, especially during the winter. That's where we heat, of course. A few things worth mentioning: renewable natural gas is growing, but is of course very small. That's the box, the red box you see in the middle of the left part of the screen. So it is growing. There's some hopes that it will grow more. Énergir, the main natural gas distributor in Quebec, has the objective to have to rise the percentage of renewable natural gas to 10% of the natural gas it distributes by 2030. Now it's around 1%. They're hopeful to make it to 3, 4, 5, and 10% in 2030. That's a big challenge because, as you know, renewable natural gas is available, but not in huge quantities. So there's a fight for the initial biomass and to get it to market and to grow the supply. Lots of talk about hydrogen. So we also mention hydrogen now in the energy system, and you see it's a relatively small sector. Currently, hydrogen is only produced from natural gas and oil products, mostly in refineries. There's a tiny green hydrogen production in Quebec. It's still a 20 megawatt electrolyzer, but it's still a tiny amount of green hydrogen that is produced. So lots of talk about hydrogen, but of course very small currently, and if you make the analysis, in the future to grow the hydrogen sector, there are many challenges that we won't discuss here, but it will definitely slow down the growth of hydrogen. And the current government sometimes, has some waves of enthusiasm behind hydrogen, and sometimes the current government just says no, it won't grow. So it's hard to know what kind of government support there is really behind hydrogen in Quebec. But definitely when the government looks at the amount of electricity that would be needed to produce significant amounts of hydrogen, then the government says, that's maybe not an official position, but it seems to be that the government is really not committed to dedicate a significant amount of hydro or wind energy or clean electricity for hydrogen production. So there were some hopes in the hydrogen community at one point that there would be significant green hydrogen production in Quebec because of the availability of cheap hydro, but it seems that you would have to divert existing cheap hydro going to the industry for hydrogen production, and that seems extremely unlikely. We still have some coal, as you can see, again, much less than in, I just checked how much coal you were still using in Ontario, and it's Ontario uses about 5 times that that amount of coal, which is still tiny compared to natural gas and oil, but it's still existing and used. And of course, we import, and I'll come back to that, we import hydro from Labrador in Quebec. So you can see the hydro imports here going into the system. And there are some exports, and the exports are represented just above the building block. You see export, and it's written in French, but the exports are there. So roughly speaking, Quebec does not have any kind of surpluses because we export about the same amount we import from Labrador. So Quebec is just a trader of electricity, but we're using a lot of electricity. And then there would be more things to discuss on that slide, but I'll switch to other things. Because there are so many things to discuss, and I'll focus on electricity. So I was mentioning that we were using a lot of electricity in buildings, in the industry, in transportation. We're using a very tiny amount of electricity in transportation, and that's basically the Montreal subway. But then, of course, the fleet of EV will grow, and since Quebecers, like everyone in North America, don't like car anymore, but we're buying SUVs, and so we're buying SUVs, electrical SUVs that are basically using twice the amount of electricity than a regular car is using. So we are, it seems like very likely that that we'll use more electricity in the future in Quebec for good and bad reasons. But currently, and I like this slide to show the amount of electricity that is used per capita in Quebec, and that's all sectors included. So that's the industry, the commercial sector, institutions, residential, agriculture. And we are almost on top of the world when it comes to electricity consumption in Quebec. Only Iceland and Norway beat us in electricity consumption. We won't discuss the case of Iceland. They have like very specific reasons why they're using so much electricity, all renewable. But there's a pattern here. Iceland 100% renewable, Norway 100% renewable electricity, Quebec 100% renewable electricity. So when you have renewable electricity and cheap renewable electricity, it seems that you use it a lot, and you for good and bad reasons. But what cannot be disputed is that we're using more than all Canadian provinces per capita, more than the Canadian average. You see Ontario here shy of 10,000 kilowatt hour per year. We're using around 3 to 4 times the amount France and Germany are using in terms of electricity. Germany is a richer country per capita than Canada. So I always find it amazing to see that you can be richer and still use less energy, way less energy per capita. And of course, the climate is different in Germany. They may not heat as much as we do, but they may also have better buildings than we do. So there are many different reasons for that. But what I want to highlight here is that not only are we using lots of electricity in Quebec, but more than in Canada. But then there are countries, again, richer than us that use less. And what's striking and is not there in this slide is that when you look at their energy efficiency and energy consumption trend in the future, they are much more aggressive in energy efficiency than we are in Canada and in Quebec. So their official pathways to decarbonize their energy system shows a decrease in absolute energy consumption in Germany, in France, in Switzerland, in all these European countries. And they're already using much less energy than we do. And in some cases, they're richer than us. So I find it particularly offending, I would say, that Canadians and Quebecers are not looking at energy consumption reductions more aggressively, because when we compare to some countries we like to be compared to, and we're using more. When we compare to the world or Haiti, for example, that you can see the amount of energy that we're using is just, and that's electricity here, but it's just crazy. And if I put a lot of emphasis here, it's because Quebec is on a path to produce 50% more electricity by 2050. So it's almost like a joke. I would be ashamed to present that to a world to develop, to people in developed in developing countries where they consume so little amount of electricity, and we would be telling them we need to produce 50% more because we don't have enough clean electricity, when I think we surely have enough. But that's again to say that to set the stage in terms of where Quebec is. The Quebec power sector structure is relatively simple, and that's probably, well, being simple is a good thing. Ontario is not as simple, and I don't think that's a good thing that you have such a more complex electricity system. It has good aspects, but you know, in Quebec, it's basically the motto was let's keep it simple, and most of the things are working well. So you have Hydro-Québec, which is a crown corporation, fully integrated generation, transmission, distribution. It is regulated, the transmission and distribution sectors are regulated by the Régie de l'Énergie, which is the Quebec Energy Board. And all the members of the Régie de l'Énergie are nominated by the government of Quebec, which also owns fully 100% of Hydro-Québec. So that's basically it in terms of the power sector. You have Hydro-Québec, owned by the government, regulated by the Quebec Energy Board, which is to some extent not very challenging in terms of Hydro-Québec and what they're asking Hydro-Québec to do or the sector. They're extremely conservative in their decisions. They don't take risk. They just basically listen to what the government says, and whatever the government says, they implement it, roughly speaking. And the government, of course, isn't shy to interfere directly with Hydro-Québec. So when like an energy minister has some ideas, then he can push them through different decrees and different laws or regulation. So although, you know, in the past 20 years or 30 years, Hydro-Québec and the power sector, the government tried to depoliticize the power sector. It is still politicized because of the direct links. There are still some industrial self-consumers. So some aluminum companies like Rio Tinto, for example, is producing a lot of electricity for its own consumption. There are IPPs that are producing wind, hydro, and biomass energy, and then selling it in cogeneration through cogeneration plants to Hydro-Québec. So only the wind, I would say, the wind sector is significant, close to 4,000 megawatt, and it will double in the next 5 years and probably triple in the next 15 years or 10 years. So much more wind is coming. And I would say the only outside body that has a say, or but very, very small say, that's why I use a light gray to say that, yes, you know, there is a reliability council, which is regional, that basically looks at what Hydro-Québec does the same way it looks at what the IESO does in Ontario in terms of reliability. And that's the only external look on the system that may have some very remote and small impact on the Quebec system, and mostly from a technical perspective. So there is an outside look. The Northeast Power Coordinating Council, it's a reliability regional body. It's interesting. Sorry, my daughter is calling me, but I will, of course, not take the phone call. So that's the situation. Simple. The only thing I will add is that although Hydro-Québec has the monopoly on big hydro development for generation, on transmission, and on distribution, there are still some small distributors, municipal distributors, and one cooperative that were not nationalized and then still operate. So if you know Montreal, the city of Westmount, in the middle of Montreal, a wealthy neighborhood, they have their own distribution company. Same thing for the city of Sherbrooke, and same thing for like 9 other places around Quebec, but it's very tiny. But still, it's not, you know, the Hydro-Québec does not have like the only distribution license for electricity in Quebec, but it's probably distributing 99% of the electricity to retail consumers. What's developing in parallel of the power sector structure, and if I mention it, it's because it will have huge implications, it may have huge implications in the future, is that the Quebec Ministry of Environment and Climate Change is running a carbon market, and all the funds from the carbon markets are going into the electrification fund. And as the name says, it's a fund that aims at electrifying things. And there's a green economy plan, le Plan d'économie verte 2030, which is the Quebec plan for to decarbonize the economy. But the key strategy is to electrify. So basically that's the key word if you want to understand the Quebec strategy to decarbonize. It's electrification. So the idea that we should decrease consumption is not totally absent of documents, but it's really not the dominant strategy. So there are EV subsidies, there are electrification programs, there are of course some efficiency programs. If you want to change your windows, you'll get some dollars from the government for that. If you want to put a heat pump, you'll get some dollars from the government for that. And then so that's how they distribute the money. But then electrification, which is the key strategy, is basically designed out of the Ministry of the Environment and not the Ministry of Economy, Innovation and Energy in Quebec. So we hope they talk to each other. Sometimes we're not convinced that they talk to each other, but they try to coordinate. But what is for sure is that they're within two different ministries. And there's no overall strategy for what are we doing. So for example, when Hydro-Québec creates its supply plan for 2030-32, then it does not take into account the electrification strategy of the government explicitly. It takes some aspects of it. Hydro-Québec is aware of that, but it's not clear exactly. Hydro-Québec is not fully aware of what the Ministry of the Environment has in store for electrification, what they will push. So it's difficult to plan. And the current government is aware of that and is trying to is planning for next fall to have a new framework, a new legislative framework to clarify their new roles and make sure the Régie de l'Énergie is more on board towards decarbonization and the fight against climate change, because now the Régie de l'Énergie is basically an economic board that looks at whether it makes economic sense to do some investment or not, but isn't looking at the greenhouse gases that may be behind an investment or not. So there is a need to change the laws for the purpose of the Régie de l'Énergie and Hydro-Québec to make sure that they work in the same direction as other parts of the government. So if we go back in more details to the Quebec energy system, we're producing a lot of electricity because we are, and then so around 200 terawatt hour of electricity produced in Quebec. Not everything is produced by Hydro-Québec. As I said, there are some industries. Around 20 terawatt hours produced by the industry for its own consumption. Then the wind, which is in green here in the pie on the top of the screen, 5% of the energy is coming from wind. That will grow, and we have a huge network. We have huge network of long distance transmission because most of the electricity is produced in the north, more than 1,000 kilometers north of Montreal. So distance isn't a problem within the province of Quebec. So of course, when we talk about Canada and why we don't share electricity, people always say, oh, it's because we have a big country and it doesn't make sense to transmit electricity from one place to another place because we are such a big country. But when it comes to take electricity from the north and bringing it down to the south, then that has never been, well, it's been a challenge, but it's been built and it's working, of course, sometimes with difficulties. But we do have these huge transmission lines coming from the James Bay area, coming from Labrador. So you see Churchill Falls here in Labrador, and the huge transmission lines, the 5,000 megawatt transmission line going south to Montreal. All the green dots you see in Gaspésie are wind farms. The red dots you see in the north and where you in les Îles de la Madeleine near Nova Scotia. So all the red dots are still the diesel power plants that are for the off-grid communities that don't have access to renewable hydro and wind. So there is still a lot of diesel being burned into, well, a lot. When I say a lot, it's a lot of red dots, but in terms of quantity, the diesel generation only represent 0.4% of the overall generation in Quebec. So it is marginal, but still present. And of course, Hydro-Québec and the government are trying to work toward decarbonization for these communities. As I mentioned, Quebec is exporting a lot of electricity, close to 40 terawatt-hour in 2021, but we imported 33 terawatt-hours, so mostly from Labrador. So you see huge increase. Of course, you probably know that this amount of electricity is purchased from Labrador at an incredibly low price of 0.2 cents per kilowatt-hour. So Hydro-Québec is buying at 0.2 cents per kilowatt-hour and selling in the States last year at more than 10 cents per kilowatt-hour. So you do the maths, 0.2, you buy at 0.2, you sell at 10, you make a good profit over that. That contract will last until 2041. After that, where will the electricity go from Churchill Falls? That's unknown, and that's around 30 terawatt-hour. Most likely there will be some deal made with between Quebec and Labrador, Newfoundland and Labrador, but we'll see what happens. But the system is in equilibrium with the internal consumption and the surpluses. The truth is that there are no surpluses. There's very little water going above the dams. There were some springs in the past where the springs were so wet that the Hydro-Québec could not turbine all the water because there was too much water and not enough demand. So there are some times when there are real surpluses in terms of electricity that cannot be used and water that cannot be stored because in the spring, the reservoirs were already full. So there was no way they could store the water for future use. So that's the situation. So sometimes we think Quebec has a lot of additional power. It may not be true. We're just in equilibrium, and as I said, we want to decarbonize further. So and the way we want to decarbonize is through electrification, which I think is not the good strategy. But that's another story. Because we want to electrify, then we'll have growing needs. These growing needs can be seen in these numbers are all coming from Hydro-Québec, and there's an energy balance and a power balance. And I'll just summarize here by saying that within 10 years, Hydro-Québec expects the energy balance to grow, while the needs to grow by 27 terawatt-hour. So that's a lot of energy, more than 14% you can see, and every sector should grow. So the residential sector in dark blue should grow, commercial should grow, industry should grow, everything should grow. And then Hydro-Québec basically says we don't have any contract for 29 terawatt-hour. So what you see in red is what Hydro-Québec needs to contract in the next 10 years if they want to be able to meet the needs of the growing demand. And in terms of power, there's a growing need of 5,000 megawatts, and not all that power is contracted. So again, they will look for additional ways in terms of making sure they can supply energy during these peak hours. What should be also seen here, and if Ontario or New York or other state or provinces decarbonize the heating system, then they'll end up, using a lot of electricity in the heating system if they do it for electrification. And in terms of peak usage, you see the residential building is the largest block in terms of the contribution to peak power demand, it's the residential sector. And we have implemented very little demand side management in Quebec. We're not talking so much about energy efficiency of buildings. We're not planning retrofits as Europeans, for example, are planning retrofits of building. So I don't know why. We just think we just need to add more power and have heat pumps, and that will solve everything. But being ambitious in terms of thermal envelope, that's something Quebec is definitely not. And I think I would say that Canada isn't either. In terms of rates, I would claim that we're very lucky because we have low rates. So you can look at the cost for consumers. Residential consumer, we pay 8.27 cents per kilowatt hour. That's all included. So there's nothing on top of that. That's what we pay, and it is subsidized because residential consumers benefit from a cross subsidy that is around 15%. So the 86 you see here, 86 you see in the residential column, that's the indice d'interfinancement. That's the amount of that's actually the percentage of the cost of service residential consumers pay to Hydro-Québec. And who's making up for the 15% remaining? It is industrial and commercial consumers that pay more than the cost of supplying them. So the cross subsidy goes from commercial and industrial consumers to residential consumers, so that we can heat our pool, basement, or our large houses with cheap electricity. I can tell you, Quebecers love that. They complain when prices go up, and I can also tell you that I'm one of the person in Quebec saying that doesn't make sense. You shouldn't subsidize all residential consumers, especially since in the last 20 years we got around 40% richer as a province. So we keep getting richer. There are some poor households in Quebec and some households that have a hard time affording electricity, and we should of course take their situation into consideration. But for the vast majority of Quebecers, we are getting richer and using lots of electricity, and it is being cross-subsidized. And we're the biggest consumption group, both in terms of power, peak power, and energy use. So don't ask me for the rationale for subsidizing the worst consumers, the worst consumer group. I don't think there is. But and I hope that will change in the future. I also want to highlight the fact that we have no power or no demand charge for residential consumers. So that's why I put a red box over the zero. That's the demand charge that we pay for power in the residential sector. It is zero. Commercial and industrial users pay a monthly demand charge per kilowatt that you see $15 or $15 or $13 per kilowatt of peak use. And of course, that helps them manage their peak load. And in Quebec, residential consumers don't pay for their peak consumption. They don't pay any demand charge. So of course, there's no incentive for them to lower their peaks, which will become more and more a problem for various reasons that we may not have time to discuss because I'm talking a lot. So I should maybe speed a little bit and just end the contextual element by a few points. So again, electrification is expected to increase power consumption by more than 100 terawatt-hour by 2050. There's a range of values that you can find, and that's without the goal of the Quebec government to attract green industries. So even more terawatt-hour could be needed. As I said, the reform in the fall is in preparation. There could be some wholesale market opening. That's something some people recommend. There can be an integrated resources plan, which we don't have now, which would make sense to try to coordinate our climate goals with our energy policy. I'm hoping there will be a tariff reform. Many people in Quebec say, for the points I just mentioned, that it doesn't make sense. So that we need to have better tariffs. And the last contextual element I will share is that we have a really inward focus for electricity. We're losing the regional or global view that I will say a few words about if you still allow me to speak for 5 more minutes. So now the regional analysis, so Quebec has a lot of electricity, very small amount of greenhouse gases per kilowatt hour, 1 gram. Even Ontario, which is decarbonized, would have an average of 26 grams per kilowatt hour. New York and New England would be around 200 grams per kilowatt hour of CO2 equivalent. So you see lots of electricity, decarbonized, very low prices. This is in US dollars, so it's lower than the numbers I showed you, but it's the average price. So there would be, a lot. It would make sense from an economic perspective to basically trade more. So that's what I've been advocating for many years. And in addition, there's a lot of storage in Quebec. We do have large dams, and I showed you the region, and there are big lakes, and you can still see these lakes. So lakes, artificial lakes, of course, in some cases. So we flooded some areas, and of course that's bad, and we probably shouldn't have flooded so much land, and there were indigenous issues with that. But now that they're flooded, we make as well use these dams as optimally as we can. And that's where I see a huge potential. So, in the last years, I've looked at, with a student, we've looked at the Canadian hydropower storage capacity. And then, so you can see that Quebec has around, or would have, that's an estimate, around 228 terawatt hour of storage capacity for hydropower. Because very often we talk about storage for electricity as, batteries or compressed air. But people tend to forget that hydropower storage is actually storage, and that there is a huge capacity. So Quebec would be first, BC would be second in terms of storage, 62 terawatt hour. Newfoundland, Labrador would be third with 28 terawatt hour of storage. So there are regions in Canada with huge amount of storage. When we look at the amount of storage, for example, Ontario is trying to build, or has, we were talking about some megawatts, so maybe 100, 200, 300 megawatts of storage, megawatt hours of storage. Here we're talking about terawatt hours, so millions of megawatt hours of storage. So there's a huge potential. It's not discussed enough. I think that the storage in Quebec is already providing huge services and providing huge significant gains for Quebec, and more could be made if we're talking more to each other. Of course, to use storage in different places, you need transmission lines. It is a state of transmission, in Quebec, but in the whole region. And this is what I called the NPCC region, for the Northeast Power Coordinating Council region, and you can already see the Atlantic Loop. So there is already, physically, the Atlantic is now connected, because there are interties between Labrador and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So there is a loop. Of course, that loop is not coordinated. And projects are not coordinated. Trade is not coordinated around everywhere, around everyone. Investment is not planned. So when New York, for example, plans for offshore wind, or it doesn't plan for lines to transmit to Ontario or Quebec or other places, and of course it doesn't make sense to make billions of investments in new generation infrastructure without planning for the transmission lines that can help everyone have access to cheap electricity when you need them, or for some markets when you have surpluses. And Hydro-Quebec is extremely happy to buy electricity from Ontario at night when it's actually at a negative price or very low price. But then if there were more transmission lines from Ontario to Quebec or New York, then Ontario could get rid of more of its electricity when it has no value, and get more when it has when the Ontario needs value. So I'm a big advocate, as I'll mention. I'll even mention it more on for more planning in terms of transmission. So basically, the implications of the current situation for Canada. Quebec could be the battery of the Northeast to balance the integration of more wind and solar generation in the region. But of course, we need to create a regional planning framework. The federal government wanted to create the Pan-Canadian Grid Council. In the end, it created the Canada Electricity Advisory Council. That council could help, but only 2% from Quebec in this 19-person council, no one from Hydro-Quebec. So I wonder how they will foster collaboration with Quebec, which is the key, could be the key battery for the region, as vast land that could also be used to generate more wind, but could still store a lot of electricity in its reservoir. I would just point, and I'm almost done, that Europe is thinking in terms of European networks, and the TSOs are the transmission system operators in Europe, and they're thinking, you know, we should think more in terms of interconnections and planning together to trade, which doesn't mean that there aren't distribution system operator that are regional. They remain regional, but they're connected, and there's some kind of larger overview that can optimize the system, because flexibility will be the key word for decarbonized power sector. And flexibility comes from different sources, but it also comes from transmission. So if you don't have transmission, you have less flexibility. And flexibility, when you have increasing share of electricity coming from renewable variable sources like wind and solar, flexibility will be extremely important. Without transmission lines, you don't have that flexibility. And that's a shame that we are not at least talking more about that in Quebec and Canada. If you want to see some of my papers talking about that, then there are some references there. And I thank you very much for listening to me. And of course, we have time for questions if you have any.
Merci. C'est très bien. This is very, very interesting. And very, very useful background, I think, for everybody, because Quebec sometimes is a bit of a mystery in terms of the electricity system and the dynamics that are going on there. So this is extremely useful from that perspective. I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'm going to ask people if you can use the raise hand function in Zoom under reactions. That would be extremely helpful. I mean, I'll keep an eye, as I've mentioned before, on the chat space as well, just if somebody wants to write in a question. But I see Susan's in the stack already, so we'll start there. And then I've got Anne McAllister after that. So Susan.
Thank you. And thank you, Pierre Olivier. That was an amazing presentation. I can't, there's so much information there. My question is, I don't know if you've had the chance yet. There was a new report that came out from Canada's energy regulator. In French, it's the Régie de l'énergie du Canada. Yeah, it just came out on, you saw that. So there were some charts that I found really interesting. I just pulled them up while you were talking that mapped out their projections for each of the provinces. And in Quebec, they see nuclear starting again in 2036. And equaling wind actually by 2050 in terms of the production. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, particularly, I mean, I'm following the mostly social political discussion around nuclear. I know what happened there. So have you any thoughts about that?
Yes, well, from a modeling perspective, you know, if you want to decarbonize and if you don't want to reduce electricity consumption, then nuclear is cost competitive. In my modeling, I do my own modeling, so that's why I'm not surprised that the Canadian Energy Regulator also shows nuclear, because if you want to decarbonize while growing the amount of electricity, then even if you have like twice or 3 times the cost of nuclear power, it comes out as competitive and complementary to wind and solar. So it does not prevent wind or solar to be built. It's just there. Now, officially in Quebec, no one is talking about nuclear power. So there's no discussion, there's no plan. I don't think it will come back. The government, although said publicly that they're not saying it's not on the table. It's not an option that they're not considering, but the public is not ready for that. The public doesn't seem ready to use less electricity, and the government doesn't seem to be ready to ask people to be more efficient. So, in 10 years, when we'll start like everyone will be fed up with wind because there will be wind farms everywhere, people might start to say, well, if we don't want to be more efficient and reduce our consumption, but still want to have electricity, then maybe nuclear is the option. It's definitely on paper an option that makes sense when you don't want to, especially if you don't want to be efficient and reduce your consumption, and don't want transmission, and no one wants transmission. So transmission lines are useful in all contexts, even with nuclear, but if nuclear is even more useful if you don't want transmission lines. And it seems that we don't want transmission lines in Canada. So sadly, if Canadians don't basically change some things in the way they manage electricity, nuclear will become an option that will appear to be the only, well, an important share of the mix.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have Anne McAllister next.
Yeah, I was wondering that if Quebec really became very aggressive about energy efficiency, could it, would renewable energy be enough to power the province and maybe even have some surplus to sell without adding nuclear?
So the short answer is yes. I made like a very quick analysis, and it's available on our website on June 13th. I actually did a webinar in French showing, you know, how Quebec could actually, without adding more and then by being more efficient and electrifying, because you need to electrify. By electrifying, you get more efficient, but you can also get even more efficient by working on thermal envelopes and having transportation systems that are bright instead of just adding EVs on the streets. So if you do different things, Quebec could definitely stay at the same level of production as now and fully decarbonize its energy system. But there would be significant changes in terms of building efficiency. So in that, I'm just saying we need to reduce energy consumption by 40% in the building sector, and then you can electrify efficient buildings, and then that's okay. Same thing for transportation. If you are much more efficient in transportation because you rely on rail, you rely on active transportation, on public transit, then you use a lot less energy, and then you electrify trains and buses, and then you gain even more. And if we do these maths, then basically, yes, Quebec could not add more capacity, but of course this is science fiction, because as all Canadians, we just don't consider energy consumption reduction as an option. It's not an option. Reducing our consumption is not an option anywhere in Canada, including Quebec.
Why do you think that is?
Because we've been blessed with so many natural resources and so little geopolitical threats that we just don't consider reducing our consumption. It's there, it's out there, it's cheap. Even where it is expensive, it remains cheap compared to world standards, and we're wealthy. So wealthy people having access to a lot of cheap energy without geopolitical threats, that makes Canadians.
Thank you.
So yeah, our discourse hasn't got to the stage where the context around energy and decarbonization is shifting, which might move those possibilities up the food chain somewhat. But I've got Simri, if that's correct, Gomery, and then James Gayday after that.
Hi, yeah, great presentation. Thank you. I'm just concerned what you just said, though, Monsieur Pineau, because right now the province is on fire. They aren't able to control the forest fires that are burning right now. As I speak, there's a group of activists in front of Stéphane Guilbeault's office with, you'll see them, Canada on Fire posters trying to tell him to, like, you know, stop subsidizing fossil fuels. If we're still wealthy, we could easily pay higher rates for our hydro and de-incentivize people from overusing so much. I mean, it's not a really hard problem to solve.
No, I'm not, that's just my analysis. If I had any power, I would just say, yes, let's raise the rates of hydro. Let's, and we'll generate more money to help poor households, lower income households to actually afford renovations in their buildings. So we need a housing strategy. We need a building strategy, but these are the things we need. But there are Canadians that are aware of that. I'm not saying many Canadians are aware, but even more Canadians don't want to change. If you look at the numbers of SUVs that are sold, it's just, what can you do? People just waste thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in a vehicle that is oversized for their own pleasure. There is no rationale behind these sales. And then you see sales keep growing.
You can't really put this on the consumers. This is an issue for government responsibility, and it would be easy to charge to have higher taxes on bigger vehicles, to have higher taxes on when they fill up gas or when they park, and all kinds of ideas. In fact, all the solutions are there. There's a book by Jason Hinkle. He's a UK called Less is More, and it's all about degrowth. I mean, we could do this like that, but there's not political. People are getting rich from fossil fuels still, right?
Yes.
Our pension plans are heavily invested in fossil fuels.
No,
we can't control that. This is effectively not really a valid democracy.
No, it's technically easy, socially very difficult, and politically.
Socially, it's a piece of cake. It's not the people that are the problem.
Well, let's go on, James. Indeed, it's worse because, Chris, I think the #1 selling truck is actually the F-Series pickups. So we've gone past the SUVs to full scale. Sort of
people will do what it's easy to do, of course.
Yeah. James Gating.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and hey, Pierre Olivier, good to see you for the presentation. Sorry, I missed the first little bit of it where I think you were going over like the institutional governance setup in Quebec, and then I heard that you mentioned that they may be conducting integrated resource planning later this year. But I guess my question is, so like Hydro-Quebec doesn't do any integrated resource planning, or there's no requirements in the province for that?
There's Hydro-Quebec does a supply plan. So they look at how much electricity their forecast says will be needed in the next 10 years. So they make their own supply plan, but they don't look at decarbonization. So in their supply plan, they don't try to say what are the options to decarbonize heating sector in Quebec. So they don't integrate that in their supply plan. They don't look at transportation in the supply plan. So they don't look at industries that could electrify or have to decarbonize, and they basically say, well, okay, do they expect some growth in industrial demand in the next 10 years? But currently they don't integrate decarbonization constraints in their supply plan, and they only look at the next 10 years, not until 2050. And the Quebec government has the goal to be net zero by 2050. So ultimately, someone has to look at the big picture, and that's why the notion of an integrated resource plan is starting to get some attention and traction in Quebec, and it's extremely likely that it will actually be some version of it will be made or started to be made in the fall.
If I could just ask a quick follow-up. So has the ministry provided any like directions on how like that resource planning process should proceed, or like what kind of things should be included in it? Or
No, now we're in consultation mode. So if you want to provide some advice, you can write to the Quebec government until August 1st, and then you can send your advice to the government. So there's been a one-day consultation with some so-called experts. I was among them, and then that was surprisingly constructive. So everyone, the government was listening. So-called experts from all fields were saying things. They were academics, but also some people from the industry, energy efficiency consultants were there too. So many people mentioned and then basically said, we need to change the tariffs. We need to probably open the market because we cannot supply everything. Hydro-Québec cannot supply everyone. So we need to allow for some wind co-op, for example, to supply consumers if they wanted to have a deal with a wind co-op or solar co-op, things like that. So I think the current government is eager to change the framework of the energy sector, and I'm still relatively optimistic that the changes will be positive, not perfect, but positive.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, the disconnect between the climate strategy and the electricity sector is fascinating, because you would have thought of all places, Quebec is where the connection would be being made the most, and what you're describing is really two silos.
Yes.
They're sort of not really talking to each other very much at all.
No.
Very interesting. Tom McLean is next.
Yes, I'd like to thank you also for the very informative presentation and discussion. Here in New Brunswick, we're hoping for the Atlantic Loop, so it can do away with need for nuclear, and we can move on to using renewable resources and building those out. But one of the things that often gets mentioned as being a cornerstone of that, of course, is making use of storage in Quebec. So if Quebec is currently basically in balance or maxed out or whatever in terms of its storage, but you mentioned the fact that it could be the battery for this region. What do you think needs to happen to allow or to enable Quebec to provide that service to the I mean, I'm thinking of the Maritimes, obviously, but even more generally to the Northeast region?
Well, so the storage would basically not increase exports from Quebec or imports. It will that there could be more exports and imports, but the net exports will be zero. I mean, basically, Quebec would take surplus wind from outside or surplus whatever from outside, and use these surpluses from outside to meet its current existing demand and keep the water in the dams. And when there are needs outside, because there's less wind, less sun, then the energy saved from the imports could be re-exported, because that energy would be stored in the dams. So in order for that to happen, we need more transmission lines, because transmission lines are key to import and export. And we need, of course, to have some kind of agreement that is the way to develop wind and solar in different regions, on the basis that you can count on these transmission lines, and there's a deal that is made, that some agreements would be made so that people would trust the reciprocity that you sell and buy. Quebec and Ontario did such a deal, when Kathleen Wynne was the premier in Ontario, and Philippe Couillard was also the premier in Quebec. They made a deal saying that the Quebec and Ontario will share 500 megawatt of power, for summer and winter. So they were sharing some capacity. So that was a formal deal, made political deal, but it could, if there was some joint planning in the region, to basically say, where do we first need to increase the transmission capacities, taking into account the storage. Because, for example, the NRCan did a study for the Atlantic Loop, and that a US consultant was hired to do the study. And when you read the study, which is actually barely available because it seems that NRCan doesn't want to make it public, but it is a public study, you realize that hydro storage was not considered in the modeling of their analysis. So that's the key element, that's one key element and benefit of the Atlantic Loop. So storage is not understood to be a key component of a new system. We all say, more wind, more sun, we need more storage, but we have a lot of storage already existing. It's already built. huge amount of storage, more than anyone can dream in terms of batteries or compressed air or whatever technology. But then for that, you need agreements, political agreements, commercial agreements, and transmission lines. And all these things are difficult to build.
If I could just add to that question, power seems to be the other sticking point in terms of peak needs in the wintertime. So even with all that storage, it can only generate so much power. I thought that was also a sticking point.
It is, but Quebec has a lot of power, and of course, has a lot of power now. Not the capacity to export. There's around 42,000 megawatt of power in Quebec, but when you look at the export capacity, it's something like probably 15,000 megawatt of export capacity. So we can only export 15,000 megawatt at a single moment. And during the winter, buildings in Quebec are using another 15,000 megawatt. And then if we're just using heat pumps in Quebec, as the current plan is put heat pumps everywhere, then basically during the peak hours in Quebec, we won't decrease the peak load because heat pumps during the coldest hours are not efficient. And so that's why I'm such a big advocate for working on the thermal envelope of buildings and more efficient buildings to basically structurally decrease the energy consumption of building and also decrease the peak power consumption of building. So Quebec, within its existing system, could generate thousands of megawatt of power over 10, 15 years. But that takes deep retrofit policies to be implemented across Quebec to change the shape of the load pattern in buildings. I'm advocating for that. Very few of us are, not enough. Some of you are, I know, but too often people are saying we need heat pumps. Heat pumps are the solution, and let's forget about retrofits because they are too difficult. But everything will be difficult in the energy transition. So I don't think we have the luxury to dismiss any option by saying it's too difficult.
I'll see.
That's two important points there. One, yes, the need for an energy systems integration as opposed to simple electrification, which is looking at what's happening on the demand side. And then secondly, as important, it's not about so it's generating additional electricity in Quebec per se, but it's about this transactive function as a storage resource, which is also then assuming production increases in other places from renewables from the Maritimes or for Ontario. And in effect, we're looking to optimize the use of the resource in Quebec is in the battery function, which is slightly different from the way this is often conceived of. It's a much more transactive set. It's not just a simple sale. It's actually integrating what's happening on the renewables and other jurisdictions with how we're using the storage asset in Quebec.
Yes.
Simri again.
I'm sorry, I think I missed completely the whole concept of storage. Are you talking about batteries?
No,
we're literally.
No.
What are you talking about?
What
do you mean by storage?
But you keep the water in the dam. So there's water in the dam behind. So there's Quebec has some reservoir dams and then some runoff rivers. So we're not talking about runoff river hydro. We're talking about hydropower with dams and storage. And basically, when there is a surplus of electricity somewhere else, then the water stays in the dam, and Quebec would use the electricity, the nuclear electricity from Ontario at night, or the surplus wind coming from Ontario or New Brunswick to supply Quebec needs. But instead of using the water that it has within its dams to meet the needs of the load, to meet the load in Quebec, we would import power, keep the hydro in the dam, and when our neighbors need the power, then we would turbine the water and export that electricity.
What's the point of that beyond profits for capitalism? Like, what would be the point of sending energy somewhere else that we could use locally and taking in nuclear from Ontario and by the way, leaving the entire north using diesel? What is the point?
No. The point is that when you build wind, your wind farm will produce too much wind during some hours, and in many places that wind is just wasted. You lose that energy. So instead of losing that energy that you produce in New Brunswick or anywhere, then you would ship it to some places where they would use that energy. So it's a more efficient use of the power, because you can just, instead of wasting it somewhere, you use it somewhere else.
Use less and it won't be wasted, and you're creating a huge infrastructure issue, right? You've got to have all the infrastructure for all this import and export of energy everywhere.
Yeah, some of it
I
is
see dollar
already-
signs. I
yeah.
guess that it's good for that.
But it is a way of managing the intermittency problem with renewables, is what it really comes down to, is how do you have a reliable electricity supply when you've got the problem the wind doesn't blow all the time.
But I'm wondering if that's a problem we even need to solve, or if we just need to work on degrowth, and then the problem wouldn't exist, and then your marvelous solution wouldn't have any application.
No,
I'm just wondering.
if we all disappear, then there's no problem at all.
Anyway,
think it's-
now I have multiple hands, so I'll go to Susan was first, and then Jennifer's you, and then Alan, and then I think we may be coming up on time at that stage.
Okay, I have three questions, so I'm trying to decide which one to ask. I guess the one I'm interested in most is when you answered my question earlier, you said in 10 years, we'll have to make some decisions about that, or that question might come to the fore. And I'm just wondering, in what you're talking about, when are the crunches going to come that we'll have to say, okay, we are maxed out. We're going to have to either have that discussion about we're going to have to reduce, or we're going to have to add something that nobody really wants, but maybe they'll see that as the better option. Do you think it's in 10 years, or did you just throw that number out?
Well, I think in the next 10 years, these questions will really be shared by everyone, because, for example, the current government wants to put EVs, 2 million EVs in Quebec. And some of them, I think most of them, but at least some of them will just increase the fleet of cars in Quebec. It's not substitution, it's just growth. And that's extremely stupid to grow the fleet of cars in Quebec, like the Quebec government. Electric SUVs in Quebec, that's basically what will happen, because we're only buying SUVs now. Then there will be problems to just plug your SUV to recharge it so there will be some shortages at one. So tariffs will have to change. There will be some investment made. Now we're planning for investing in new wind farms. So rates will rise in the next 5 to 10 years because of all the investments that are currently being planned. Demand will rise in such a bad profile, because people have a flat rate now, so they are not incentivized to charge at the right time. So there will be all of these issues that will become more and more salient, and then people will have to think, okay, now are we becoming more serious about reducing our consumption, which I think would be the best option? Are we becoming more serious about, thinking about alternatives? And then I think these trade-offs will have to come, at least in Quebec, in the next 10 years. It will be difficult, because these are things that people are not used to think about. These are the global trade-offs that are very hard to capture and manage.
Thank you.
Indeed, in Ontario, we may be closer to that line already. Jennifer's you.
Hi. Yeah, so that is a great presentation. So as Mark said, Quebec is always like a secret, especially Hydro-Quebec is secret to us. So a question about industrial load. So we know that because of supply chain disruption, and also like national security or to create jobs. So we see that US and EU policy makers, they are like investing and bringing more like manufacturing onshore or actually reshore in the US and in EU. I think it's also happening in Canada. So like the industrial demand load does it like assess the impact of like industrial onshoring on manufacturing and the impact on the electricity demand in Quebec? How it's going to? how like it's going to grow. Yeah.
So it's, I mean, the current economic minister, which is the minister of the economy, the innovation and energy, and that's a new way of organizing things. Before we had the energy and natural resources ministry, and now we have like economy and energy ministry. And his strategy is really to attract green industries, new manufacturing industries, battery plants. So there's a real strategy to try to attract more big industries, trying to sell our clean electricity and probably still cheap electricity to these big industries. Now, the problem is that this minister, when he thought about his strategy, he did not fully understand the electricity sector. So he thought, like many people, there's a lot of green electricity that is cheap, so we'll just allocate. And then Hydro-Québec had to tell him, no, we don't have so many surpluses. We cannot allocate like megawatt hours of or terawatt hours of energy to like so many companies. So now, some choices have to be made. Where will we get this electricity? Who will pay for that? Because all the new projects that will come, they will increase the average rate of everyone. So every consumers in Quebec will start complaining about the new consumers that are coming in and increasing their rates. So who's going to benefit from the amount of energy that we allocate or that the government allocates to new industrial players? So so far there's been almost nothing in terms of new industries coming in Quebec, but a lot, the government says, they have up to like 20,000 megawatt of industrial users that would like to hook up to the system, which of course is not feasible. So they will have to pick and choose and realize, well, how are we going to supply these industries? And these are unanswered questions. Energy efficiency, energy consumption reductions, there are huge potential. Hydro-Québec estimates the energy consumption reduction that is technically feasible and economically profitable to 25 terawatt hour. So we could reduce, by Hydro-Québec's study, by 25 terawatt hour the electricity consumption in Quebec. And if we were doing that, then we would save a lot, and we could reallocate that energy for new industries and grow the economy. And hopefully they would be green. They would be really green beyond the word. So there would be options, but then you have to be serious about energy efficiency, and we're not. So we have to be serious about building new wind farms, and we're kind of serious in building new wind farms.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think that's an interesting question that people are only beginning to wrap their heads around. There's a lot of discussion about reindustrialization and onshoring, and not necessarily the questions how much of this is going to be realized, and then also what the implications are in terms of electricity and energy demand. Anne McAllister, and then I have Judith Northleaf, and I think we'll have to finish there because we're coming up on time.
Thank you. My ears picked up a while back when you said something about importing wind energy from New Brunswick. I'm from New Brunswick, and I was wondering, do you know if there are agreements to do this between Quebec and New Brunswick in the works or not? And I'm just wondering, in terms of the kind of proposed developments that we're hearing about for like the North Shore wind, and but we don't hear about possibility of import in that in the proposal. So I'm wondering if you know anything about if there are any agreements that are being talked about right now.
No, I'm not aware of anything between Quebec and New Brunswick, any discussion. I'm pretty sure there are none. I think the only discussions that are taking place are those in closed rooms for the Atlantic Loop. And nobody knows really what's happening in the Atlantic Loop. Some announcements were supposed to be made, but every year, it's supposed to, a deal has to be made. But I don't think a deal will be made soon, but I'm not aware of any specifics. The only thing I'm aware of is that provinces don't talk enough with each other. And everyone is planning in silo, and this is not the best approach to decarbonize. Even if we were following some degrowth and reducing consumption, we would still gain from cooperation, because humans gain so much by exchanging among themselves that we should not cut off, exchanges between humans and provinces, even in the energy sector.
Last question to Judith Northleaf.
Hi, I just have a quick question. So with the climate crisis, we're looking at more and more extreme weather events and extreme events like the huge fires that are burning up north.
Yes.
Is this a problem relying on these transition lines that come so far down from the north, and then if we even build out the grid further? Anyhow, I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we did have some power outages in Montreal because some lines were affected by the fires. So of course there will be some vulnerabilities that will develop with more transmission lines, but vulnerabilities will come from everywhere. So the key point is flexibility. We will need to be more flexible to adapt more, and flexibility comes from many sources. We need as consumers to be more flexible, and well, first to reduce our consumption, but also to have a more flexible consumption. But that's only one source of flexibility. Another source of flexibility comes from transmission lines. They offer some flexibility options now. They can be made more, they can offer more if we build more. And there's no perfect solution. So of course there will be some new vulnerabilities coming and new weaknesses coming. All the literature, everyone that has studied the power networks and how you increase the penetration of wind and solar concludes that yes, more transmission lines are needed. That's what the European countries are building. There are so many notions in terms of super grid in the US. There's countless reports saying that more transmission lines would be beneficial. There would be some problems, but overall, there would be more gains than problems with these transmission lines. And that doesn't mean people cannot put their solar power PV solar panel on their roof and be self-sufficient. That's fine. That's fine for some people, but in cities, in densely populated cities, you don't have enough space to put these rooftop solar panels, and for industries that we will still need, you need some wind farms, you need some solar farms. You cannot have decentralized plants everywhere. So you need some centralized wind farms, solar farms, hydropower, and you need to be able to share because the wind is not blowing at the same time everywhere. The sun is not shining at the same time everywhere. So if producers in Nova Scotia can help consumers in another province at one point, because there's more sun in Nova Scotia earlier in the morning than in the western part of Canada, then they could ship some electricity. So there's a lot of trades that would be interesting for everyone to lower the investment cost of everyone. So it's not a question of investing in transmission lines just for the pleasure of making dollars with transmission lines. It's actually to reduce the overall investment cost. And you can read my paper that I showed in my deck in my presentation. That's one paper saying that you actually decrease the investment by having more transmission, but it's only one paper. You don't trust me, read other papers. I can send you other papers, and they'll all say more transmission decreases the overall cost, even if transmission is expensive. So even if you compensate people because they don't want to see the transmission line and it's ugly, and then you want to help them create some kind of compensations in some ways to make them accept, even so it works. Transmission is very important.
On those notes of flexibility, I think, well, the clock has become our enemy as we're up against time. But I want to say merci to Pierre Olivier. This has been an extremely insightful and very, very informative conversation. And to thank everybody for their participation as well. And so I will, I'm going to end the recording here.